Hi everyone, and welcome to Core Lecture 25. Today we'll discuss maximizing persuasion through word choice. Before we begin, you'll need access to the following materials for today's lecture assignment. You'll need access to your Project 4 Civic Engagement Argument materials, and you'll also need access to your weekly homework document. The purpose and goals for today's lecture are as follows. We'll examine the applications of rhetoric at a local or sentence level. We'll define and explore different locations to optimize word choice, and we'll discuss strategies for best determining word choice. Before we really jump into the specifics of this lecture, I wanted to open up this discussion and this idea with one of my favorite quotes, not just my favorite Dumbledore quote, but one of really my favorite quotes overall. And again, it comes from the Harry Potter series, namely Albus Dumbledore, who says, "Words are, in my not so humble opinion, our most inexhaustible source of magic, capable of both inflicting injury and remedying it." I think I like this quote so much because Dumbledore is so succinctly able to define the power of words. You know, as he says towards the end, words can either make or break someone's day. They can start wars, or they can create peace. And I know these are very extreme, sort of dramatic, hyperbolic examples, but really, it's always important to be aware of the impact our words can have on the way that we're understood and the way that we're communicating about certain ideas. To return to the focus of word choice, at least in our specific course, why do we care about words? Why do we care about words in academic writing? Why do we care about words in more public-facing writing? The first thing it's so important to remember is that words function as symbols that are tied to larger cultural meanings and values. We'll look at a few examples here in just a minute, but I'm sure many of you can identify various terms that really do promote certain images or understanding. So if you say, if you use the term family based off of Southern Utah culture, it's often something that has a very positive association with it. It's a positive symbol. It usually means love, acceptance, things of that sort. However, in other cultures, that might not be the case, where family is not so heavily stressed or valued. But in that case, the word family functions as a symbol for emotions, for experiences that a community or members of an audience are likely to hold. Words can also quickly frame your thoughts on a topic or idea. So, if I were to say, the man ran down the street, that sentence the meaning or the understanding of it can be changed based off of the words we use to describe either the man or to describe how he was running. So the very scary man ran menacingly down the street, right? So that creates, one kind of image. Or you could say the happy man ran quickly down the street to complete the marathon, right? So based off of the words that we use and what we decide to include, it can greatly frame the sentences and how they are understood from their core and beyond. It can also help you emphasize the severity or importance of your argument. It's more common in with writing found in popular sources, but you often do tend to see kind of more startling headline-esque type language to really, stress how important something is. So the housing crisis, you think about that back in 2007, 2008. Yeah, we didn't just have a housing problem. We just didn't have a housing incident. No, we had a housing crisis. Crisis, of course, carries with it more weight in terms of severity, and it seems like a far more pressing issue than if we say the housing problem or the housing issue or the housing hiccup. So obviously, we can, based off of the words that we use, can create a greater sense of immediacy that is appropriate to whatever topic we're talking about and the specific argument we're making on it. Words also are a common site for invoking pathos. And remember, way back from week 1, week 2, pathos is your appeal to emotion. So that's, when you invoke pathos through words, remember that it is really broken down into two camps, happiness and anger. And then we can further branch more emotions and emotional responses from those two terms. But how do we get the audience to feel that way? How do we get the audience to feel sad instead of happy or joyous instead of frustrated? It all comes down to the words we choose to include in our writing. So here are some examples of how, at least in the political sense, candidates have used very specific words. And I like political campaign ads to emphasize this for a specific reason. Oftentimes, you don't have a lot of space on political campaign ads, and so the word choice has to be on point. It has to be persuasive in its own right. So, we look from going left to right here. We've got one of Barack Obama's campaign posters, and I'm not quite sure if this was from 2008 or 2012. I believe 2008, though. But at this point, there were a lot of issues going on where folks were like, we've got this economic issue, these economic crises going on. We're still involved in a war. We've got, several other issues that are facing Americans. And so the Obama campaign used this phrase, change we can believe in. So, he said, okay, change, not alterations. Even though it's a solid synonym, it is, it means pretty much change, alter. He didn't say alteration we can believe in. That would be so silly. No, he used the term change. Also note how the campaign says change we can believe in, not change I can believe in, not change you can believe in, but again, invokes the sort of collective on there. So we also see kind of that careful word choice also in Bernie Sanders, and I believe this one was from 2016, but could also be recycled for 2020 as well, and it says not me, us. And so again, he could say, not I, we, like, of course, but there were very specific word choices, and of course there are mechanical and grammatical issues with, my suggested alternative. But again, there are certainly other ways he could have said, not me, we. Okay, well, why did he use us instead of we? So thinking about the purpose of what one term can prompt in terms of stirring a certain emotion among audiences that another can't. We also see this from Trump's campaign poster from 2016. So make America great again. So what's really fascinating, the terms great again. So by doing this, it's what's really interesting is we've got this term great here, and of course, much like the other two, we could easily swap that word out for a synonym. So much like with Obama, we could change to alter or alteration. And then that's the same here. We could take the term great and we could say awesome, totally tubular, super psychedelic, something along those lines. But the term great fit in, and fit the message that was to be sent. And also, what's really fascinating, and what a lot of rhetoricians have looked at with this particular campaign slogan, is the use of the word again. And what this calls back to is to say, okay, well, there was a time in which the United States was great. Let's bring it back. Let's, work that into where we are today. And so often a sort of thought experiment I propose is, if you were to take out the word again, how would the message ring differently? How would it be received in a different way? How would people respond to it differently? Would they respond to it differently if there wasn't sort of that historical callback that's implied with the use of the term again? So this is pretty much me nitpicking through these, doing very specific rhetorical analyses, but I hope to demonstrate that words can have a major impact, and they can ultimately influence how we understand a message, how we respond to it, and ultimately how we internalize it and incorporate it into our sense of being or into our daily routines. So now that we have stressed the importance of word choice, let's start to apply, or think about how we can apply those importance in our own writing. So when we think about sites for strong word choice, there are really three key areas in our sentence that we can keep an eye out for. So I imagine many of you, this was content that you heard throughout most of middle school and high school, but what I really would like you to keep an eye out for and think critically about in your own writing is not, the rote memory of, or the rote memorization of what adjectives, adverbs, and verbs are, but how we can use them rhetorically, how we can purpose them and use the correct adjectives, use the best adverbs, use the most, telling verbs to get our message across. So again, I'm not going to quiz you on what an adjective is or what an adverb is, but I do want to see that you're demonstrating critical thought on how you can use these parts of a sentence to make your message more persuasive. Our attention to adjectives. Adjectives are a word or a phrase that modifies a noun. Remember that a noun is a person, place, or thing, and a noun is always going to be the subject of your sentence. However, just because it's a noun doesn't mean that it's necessarily the subject. So do keep that in mind. Sometimes nouns can take additional roles in a sentence as well, be it as a direct object, indirect object, if it's a part of an additional phrase that's sort of included in the core sentence. Anywho, so a noun is a person, place, or thing, and again, is always going to be the subject of your sentence. Now, adjectives are going to be words or phrases that describe that person, place, or thing. So the heavy winds could damage the boats in the marina. Exposure to dangerous and potentially lethal chemicals should drive current discussions regarding nuclear energy. After receiving additional grant funding, the empowered students enacted positive change in their community. So each one of these, much like I did with the political campaign ads, we could change any one of these adjectives and it would alter our understanding of that sentence and ultimately the argument that that sentence is supporting or further investigating. So if you were to say, the heavy winds could damage the boats in the marina. Okay, well, if we change that to the light winds could damage the boats in the marina, my thought then might not be, oh, okay, well, we need to do something to protect the boats from the wind. My thought would be, well, what kind of poorly constructed boat are you putting in the marina if light winds are going to damage it? We could look at the second sentence if we flipped it and said exposure to safe and non-toxic chemicals should drive current discussions regarding nuclear energy. Maybe I say, okay, well, maybe I could then assume that nuclear energy doesn't have any negative outputs, that perhaps it's just safe and clean chemicals, right? And so rather than this sentence, which very clearly paints nuclear energy as something that is not to be tinkered with or should result in more serious discussion. So we can see again how word choice is important there. And of course, same goes with the last one, last example as well. After receiving additional grant funding, the empowered students enacted positive change in their community. Well, it might be silly, but you could say after receiving additional grant funding, the apathetic students enacted no change in their community. So then rather than saying, oh, look, the students are making good use of that grant funding, I could say, oh, those students are blowing the grant funding. Like, that's crazy. So we can see how adjectives in our writing really do enrich the meaning and can help us more clearly communicate to our readers how we feel about a noun, again, or a person, place, or thing. The next component that we want to look at would be an adverb. So that's going to be a word or phrase modifying a verb, adjective, or another adverb. So they can wear many hats in this sentence. Now, what adverbs do then is they're kind of like the journalists of the sentence. They can provide greater detail regarding how, when, where, how much, and how often something occurred in a particular sentence. So, for example, in the past, companies have quietly covered their mistakes. So this is an adverb and not an adjective because the word that is being modified here is covered, and that's a verb, not a noun, which we'll look at more here in just a minute. The new fraternity will be built near the main university administrative building. So, near as opposed to far, as opposed to a specific amount, 5 miles, half a mile, whatever. Today, we are seeing the resurgence of diseases that were once considered eradicated. So did we see it 5 years ago? No, but now, yes, we're seeing it. The blizzard invoked an extreme amount of worry among residents. Okay, well, were they a little worried? Were they super worried? Somewhere in between, it was an extreme amount of worrying. And then recent studies have confirmed that lightning rarely strikes the same place twice. So how often? Okay, rarely. And again, this is an adverb because it is modifying an action as opposed to a person, place, or thing. And again, we can see the importance of words and what these words that are bolded here can do rhetorically. We can think about it if we change them. How does that change the meaning or the understanding of the sentence? So if I were to say the new fraternity will be built far from the main university administrative building. Okay, well that, leads me to think very different things than if I hear it's built near it. Looking at the blizzard invoked an extreme amount of worry among residents. Well, if I were to have written the blizzard invoked no amount of worry among residents, maybe at that point I can assume, okay, well, maybe these folks live in a place where blizzards are common or heavy snowfall is common. Okay, so they're not worried. We're all good. But if I see an extreme amount of worry, I'm thinking, okay, well, obviously my heart goes out to them. They must not be used to this. This must be, a new or unpredictable weather pattern that they're seeing. And so just by changing these adverbs here and adding in those little bit of details, I, as the reader, have a better understanding of that sentence and how the writer wants me to understand the content of that sentence. Everything from the verbs and even the adjectives or other adverbs that are included. And finally, we want to consider verbs. So those are going to be words or phrases indicating action. And that is going to be the action performed by the actor or the subject of the sentence. I always think back to when I was growing up, the channel Nickelodeon always, or they had this campaign for active lifestyles, and it basically said, verb, it's what you do. And they would focus on kids, running, playing soccer, jumping rope, things of that sort. So that is one way that I've always remembered what a verb was, both when I was younger and even today. Verb, it's what you do. Or in this case, a verb, it's what the subject of the sentence does. But with verbs, we can have a lot of fun and get really creative with the verbs that we select. So let's look at some of these examples here. Tinker around. If we decide to change one here or there, how does that change the meaning or the overall impact of the sentence? So here are some examples. Predatory lenders pounce on those who miss payments. This research demonstrates that Red Cross volunteers emotionally comfort those in need in addition to providing important medical services. In the wake of the final movie's release, Star Wars fans will race to theaters to secure their tickets for The Rise of Skywalker. Okay, so each of the bolded words here represent a verb. So, lenders pounce, volunteers comfort, fans race and secure. We've got that these are verbs that the subject is performing, or the action that the subject is performing. And I also want to note these are examples of active verbs as opposed to passive verbs. If you haven't watched the mini lecture yet on active and passive verb, or I believe it's titled Active and Passive Voice, I would recommend doing that. This might be a good opportunity to watch that mini lecture if you haven't done so already. But when we think about what verbs do, they describe an action being carried out. So if we were to say predatory lenders gently approach and tap on the shoulder for those who miss payments, obviously that creates a very different image in our mind of what a predatory lender might be. With the word pounce, typically you might think of, I think of cats, a cat pounces on a mouse. And it's very kind of sneaky and very deliberate, and oftentimes the thing that is being pounced on is seen as more innocent. So by using that word pounce there, we are creating a very specific visual. If we look down to the next one, this research demonstrates that Red Cross volunteers emotionally comfort those in need. So if we were to say, emotionally distance themselves from those in need, then obviously that's going to make volunteers of the Red Cross look perhaps not as caring and compassionate. But if we say emotionally comfort those in need, then obviously that constructs them in a very different way for the reader. Verbs can also help us emphasize urgency as well, much like we talked about with adjectives and adverbs. So Star Wars fans will race to theaters to secure their tickets. We could say Star Wars fans will lackadaisically go to theaters to buy their tickets. So if you say Star Wars fans will drive to theaters and buy their tickets. Okay, yeah, but we all drive, and sometimes we drive slow and we don't drive with urgency. And if I buy something, it's not like there's really a possibility I couldn't buy it. It just sort of implies that it's there for my purchasing if I so choose. But if I race to secure a ticket, that means that I am hustling to get down to that theater because I, as a Star Wars fan, want tickets to that movie, and I want to make sure that I have them in my possession, and there is no way that I am not seeing that movie when it premieres. So we see how verbs, even though that ultimately if we were to say fans will drive to theaters to purchase their tickets, okay, still kind of same concept, but by changing those verbs, we can create a greater sense of urgency. There are a few additional considerations that we want to keep in mind. So, first and foremost, always keep your audience in mind. What kind of adjectives, adverbs, and verbs will speak well to them? So if you're writing a paper about, healthcare or education, maybe you use happy patients, successful students. So what are their values and what kinds of words can you use that would speak to those values? What I'd often recommend is as you're going through and you're reading about who could potentially, put your argument into action, read some of the stuff that they've written. So going back to our example from the previous lecture, if you're writing on pushing start time back a bit and you're writing to the superintendent, okay, well, what's on the superintendent's webpage? What does their regular newsletter look like? What kind of words do they commonly use in their own writing that might prove persuasive to them when you use them in your own, but have also identified them as an audience? Also, don't overdo it on the dramatics, especially in academic writing. So having these very emotionally driven and powerful words can be helpful, but when it starts to read like a soap opera, then you're going to lose your audience. And I would say most definitely in academic situations, because with academic audiences, the primary focus is to engage with ideas, and if the ideas are sort of drowned out in all of this sort of all of these unnecessary adjectives, if you were to say the convoluted, dense, difficult text to read, okay, well, those are great adjectives, but you could also just say the difficult text, right? So you don't want to overdo it. And again, if you realize that your argument is starting to read more like a soap opera, you might want to go back to the drawing board with your word choice. Really determine what word or words get your meaning across the most effectively, and then remove everything else. I would also say avoid thesaurus definitions. Now that can go back to the change I made on the Obama campaign ad. So change, alteration. So again, those two terms, those two words are synonyms. They basically can, in the proper context, be swapped out for one another. But of course, like when I made that suggestion, alterations, we can believe in. It just sounds silly. It doesn't sound right. And so it was wildly inappropriate for that given context. And so even though a word may be included in a thesaurus entry next to a word you want to replace, it doesn't mean it's always the best. It doesn't mean that it should always be used. And finally, you want to understand the impacts your words have on the overall argument. So if you are trying to create a sense of urgency, is your argument something incredibly urgent that has to happen tomorrow? Or can it wait a month? Can it wait 6 months? Should it be implemented in a year? And make sure that the words that you're using reflect that, especially as you paint the sense of severity and paint the sense of urgency that accompany your argument in the way that you're constructing it. For the lecture assignment, you will need to review your current materials for Project 4. Now, if you are still at a phase where you have just ideas rolling around up in your noggin, you can take this as a generative writing opportunity to create content that you could later use for your Project 4 rough draft and later your final draft. Now, in your writing, I want you to identify one adjective, one adverb, and one verb that you believe can be stronger. I'd like you to replace each selected word or phrase with one you find more appropriate and that will help you strengthen the persuasiveness of your overall argument. I'd then like you to compose a brief rationale, so about 30 words each for each selected word or phrase changed. So going back to our example, so you could say, I replace the word altercation with change because altercation just sounded, too formal or inappropriate given, the type of emotion. It sounded too formal for the type of emotion I wanted my audience to feel. So really, I just want to know what you changed and why you changed it. So for your weekly homework, you'll need to include the core Lecture 25 summary and assignment in your Week 13 homework submission. Overall, your Week 13 homework submission should include the summaries and assignments for core lectures 24 and 25, as well as a mini lecture of your choice. And all of that is due to Canvas before 11:59 p.m. on Sunday, November 17th. All right, if you have any questions or would like to chat about any of these concepts further, please feel free to reach out to me via Canvas CM. All right, everyone, until next time.